The rain had not stopped for 3 days in the Oregon Cascades, turning the forest into a dripping, whispering maze of fog and shadow. In the autumn of 1908, the logging camps scattered through the mountains had grown quiet, not from lack of work, but from unease. Men spoke in hushed tones of something wrong in the woods, something that moved when the mist grew thick and the light began to fail. Mabel Thornquest arrived alone. No one in the settlement of Gray Hollow knew why a woman of her refinement would travel so far into such an unforgiving place. She came by carriage at dusk, dressed in mourning black despite there being no known death tied to her name. Her face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and her eyes carried a stillness that made people uncomfortable without understanding why. She rented a small cabin at the edge of the forest, far from the other homes, and paid in gold coins that looked older than they should have been. At first, the townsfolk dismissed her as peculiar but harmless. She kept to herself, walking into the forest at odd hours, sometimes before dawn, sometimes long after midnight. She carried no lantern, yet she never seemed to stumble. Hunters began noticing strange markings carved into the bark of trees deeper in the woods, symbols that none could recognize, etched with precise, deliberate cuts. When asked, Mabel would simply smile faintly and say she enjoyed mapping the silence. Then the animals began to disappear. It started with small things, rabbits, foxes, but within a week, even deer and elk were vanishing. Trappers found their snares torn open, not broken but carefully undone. The forest itself seemed to recoil. Birds no longer sang near Gray Hollow, and even the wind felt hesitant, as if unwilling to pass through certain stretches of trees. One evening, a logger named Peter Haynes claimed he saw Mabel standing in a clearing miles from her cabin. He had been returning late when he noticed a faint glow through the fog. Drawn toward it, he came upon her kneeling in the mud, surrounded by those strange symbols carved not just into trees, but into the ground itself. At the center lay the body of a stag, perfectly still, its eyes wide and glassy. Mabel was whispering to it, though the words made no sense, soft, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby spoken backward. Peter fled before she could notice him, but the next day he refused to return to the forest. By nightfall, he was gone from Gray Hollow entirely. After that, things grew worse. People began to hear sounds at night, low murmurs drifting through the trees, sometimes rising into something like distant weeping. A few swore they heard their own names being called from the darkness, always in a voice they almost recognized. Doors were barred earlier each evening, and no one dared travel alone. Despite the fear, no one confronted Mabel Thornquest. Until the Miller family's youngest child disappeared. She had been playing near the treeline at dusk when her mother turned away for only a moment. When she looked back, the girl was gone. There were no tracks leading away, no signs of struggle, only a single symbol carved into a nearby tree, fresh and glistening as if cut moments before. A search party formed immediately. Reluctantly, they headed toward the deeper forest, following a growing sense of dread that led them closer to Mabel's cabin. They found it empty. Inside, the walls were covered in those same symbols, drawn in charcoal and something darker that no one dared identify. At the center of the room stood a wooden table, stained and scarred, upon which rested a collection of objects, bones, feathers, and small personal items that clearly belonged to people from Gray Hollow. Among them was the missing girl's ribbon. The search party pressed on, now driven by fear and anger. As night fell, they reached the clearing Peter Haynes had described. The fog there was thicker than anywhere else, clinging to their skin like damp cloth. And in the center, they saw her. Mabel Thornquest stood barefoot in the mud, her black dress soaked and clinging to her thin frame. Around her lay several shapes, too small, too still. She was no longer whispering, she was speaking clearly now, her voice echoing unnaturally through the clearing, as though the forest itself were repeating her words. The men shouted, demanding she stop, demanding answers. Slowly, she turned to face them. Her eyes were wrong. They reflected no light, no emotion, only an endless depth that seemed to pull at anyone who looked too long. She smiled, and it was then they noticed her teeth were stained dark, almost black. "You came too early," she said calmly. "It isn't finished." The men rushed forward, but the ground beneath them shifted, not physically, but perceptually. The trees seemed to bend inward, the fog thickened until it became almost solid, and the symbols carved into the earth began to glow faintly. Some of the men fell to their knees, clutching their heads as if something were clawing inside their thoughts. Mabel raised her hands, and the whispering returned, louder now, layered with countless voices speaking in unison. Then everything went silent. When the survivors stumbled back into Grey Hollow at dawn, there were fewer of them. None could fully explain what had happened. They spoke of losing time, of walking in circles, of seeing things that could not exist. The clearing, they said, was gone. No matter how they searched afterward, they could never find it again. Mabel Thornquest vanished that same night. Her cabin stood abandoned, the symbols inside slowly fading over time, though some claimed they never disappeared entirely. The missing were never found. Grey Hollow itself did not last much longer. Within a year, it was deserted, left to rot beneath the endless rain. To this day, deep in the Oregon Cascades, there are places where the forest feels wrong, too quiet, too watchful. Hunters still report seeing strange markings on trees, fresh despite the passing decades. And sometimes, when the fog is thick and the light begins to fail, a lone figure in black can be glimpsed between the trees, moving without sound, as if she has all the time in the world to finish what she started. The fog did not lift after that night. It lingered longer than it should have, clinging to the forest floor like something alive, as if the Cascades themselves were holding their breath. Those who had survived the clearing never truly returned to normal. They spoke less, slept poorly, and avoided mirrors. A few claimed that when they looked too long at their own reflection, they saw something standing behind them, not a shape, not a shadow, but a presence waiting just out of sight. Within weeks, the first of them disappeared. No struggle, no farewell, just empty homes and cold fireplaces. The townsfolk began to notice a pattern. Each disappearance followed a night when the fog rolled in thickest, when the air felt heavy and the forest seemed to whisper again. The same whispering they had heard in the clearing. They started hearing her voice. At first, it came in dreams. A soft, familiar murmur, calling them deeper into sleep. Then it followed them into waking hours, faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind. Some heard their names, others heard promises. A few claimed she spoke directly into their minds, as if distance meant nothing at all. One man, Elias Broom, tried to leave Grey Hollow. He packed his things before dawn, refusing to stay another night. As he rode his horse down the narrow trail leading out of the valley, he swore he saw her standing between the trees ahead. Mabel Thornquest, still, silent, watching. He turned back. By the time he reached town again, he was no longer the same. His face had gone slack, his eyes hollow. When people asked what he had seen, he only whispered, "She's not in the forest anymore." That was when the markings returned. Fresh carvings began appearing, not just deep in the woods, but on the outskirts of the settlement itself. On fence posts, on doors, on the wooden walls of homes while families slept inside. The symbols were more intricate now, more deliberate, as if whatever had guided Mabel before was growing stronger, or closer. One night, a woman woke to the sound of scratching. Slow, patient scratching, just outside her bedroom wall. She lay frozen, listening as it traced a careful pattern across the wood. When she finally gathered the courage to open the door, the sound stopped instantly. Outside, the fog pressed close, thick and suffocating. On the wall, carved deep and fresh, was a symbol larger than any seen before. And beneath it, written in uneven, trembling lines, "Found you." Panic spread through what remained of Grey Hollow. Some tried to burn the markings, but the wood refused to catch fire where the symbols had been carved. Others attempted to leave, but those who ventured too far into the forest either returned changed, or did not return at all. Then came the night the forest moved. It began with a low rumble, deep beneath the earth, like distant thunder that never quite broke. The trees creaked and groaned, their trunks shifting ever so slightly, as if turning towards something unseen. The fog thickened until it swallowed the sky completely, leaving the town in a dim, endless twilight. And then the whispering started again. Louder than ever before. It came from everywhere, above, below, within the walls, inside their own heads. Voices layered upon voices, all speaking at once, all echoing the same strange, rhythmic cadence Mabel had used in the clearing. The remaining townsfolk gathered in the center of Grey Hollow, desperate for safety in numbers. But even there, the fog crept in, curling around their feet, rising slowly like a tide. That was when they saw her. She stood at the edge of the crowd, as if she had always been there. Mabel Thornquest looked unchanged, still pale, still silent, but there was something else now. The faint glow that once surrounded her had deepened into something darker, something that seemed to absorb the light rather than give it. The ground beneath her feet bore no marks, no footprints, as though she wasn't entirely present. No one dared move. "You left the circle unfinished," she said softly, her voice cutting cleanly through the chaos. So it followed. A man tried to speak, to demand answers, but the words died in his throat as her gaze fell on him. For a brief moment, he seemed to understand something, something so vast and terrible that his knees gave out beneath him. It needed a way through, Mabel continued. And now it has one. The symbols around the town began to glow. Not brightly, but enough to be seen through the thickening fog, each one pulsing faintly, in time with something like a heartbeat. The ground trembled again, stronger this time, and cracks spread through the earth, forming patterns that mirrored the carvings. Some tried to run. They didn't get far. The fog swallowed them whole, and their screams cut off as abruptly as if they had never existed. Mabel closed her eyes, lifting her hands slightly, not in control, but in surrender. And then, from somewhere beneath the forest, something answered. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. It was a presence, vast, ancient, and impossibly aware. The kind of awareness that did not see people as individuals, but as pieces, as openings, as opportunities. The whispering stopped. In its place came silence so complete it felt heavy. When the fog finally receded days later, Grey Hollow was gone. Not abandoned. Not destroyed. Gone. Where the settlement once stood, there was only forest, dense, untouched, as if no human hand had ever built there. No cabins, no paths, no signs of life. Even the ground seemed older, undisturbed by time. Travelers who passed through the Oregon Cascades in later years spoke of a strange area where compasses failed and sound behaved oddly. Some claimed to see figures moving between the trees, too still to be animals, too distant to be clearly human. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the mist begins to rise, a voice can be heard, soft, patient, and unmistakably close. Not calling out, but waiting, as if whatever came through that night is still there, learning, watching, and searching for the next place where the circle might be finished again. Years passed, though in that part of the Oregon Cascades, time no longer seemed to move the way it should. Hunters began avoiding the region entirely, not because of stories, but because of experience. Trails shifted when no one was looking. Landmarks disappeared. Men who had spent their entire lives navigating the wilderness found themselves lost within minutes of stepping too close to where Grey Hollow had once stood. Maps refused to agree with the terrain, and compasses spun lazily as if disinterested in direction. Yet the place drew people in. Not many, but enough. In the spring of 1916, a survey team was sent into the mountains to chart new logging routes. They were practical men, uninterested in superstition, and they dismissed the warnings from nearby towns as nothing more than exaggerated folklore. Their leader, Thomas Keene, kept a detailed journal of their expedition. The entries were normal at first. Weather conditions, soil quality, notes on tree density. Then, on the fifth day, his writing changed. He described finding carvings on trees that did not match any known language or tribal markings. He noted that the forest had grown unnaturally quiet, and that the men had begun hearing sounds at night, soft movements just beyond the reach of their campfire light. By the seventh day, Keene wrote that one of his men had gone missing. No tracks, no signs of a struggle. Just gone. The remaining team insisted on turning back, but Keene refused. He wrote that they were close to something significant, something that explained the strange distortions in the land itself. His tone became increasingly erratic, his words rushed, as though he feared running out of time. On the ninth day, he wrote about the fog. It had rolled in suddenly, thick and suffocating, cutting visibility down to a few feet. The men stayed close together, but even then, they began losing sight of one another. Keene described hearing voices in the mist, familiar voices, calling from impossible directions. One entry ended mid-sentence. The journal was found months later at the edge of the forest, its pages damp but intact. There was no sign of Keene or his team. Tucked into the back of the journal was something else. A map. At first glance, it appeared to be a rough sketch of the region. But upon closer inspection, the lines did not match any known geography. Instead, they formed a pattern, interlocking shapes that resembled the symbols once carved into the trees of Grey Hollow. At the center of the map, Keene had drawn a circle. And inside it, written in a trembling hand, "She is not the door." The map changed everything. Word of it spread quietly, passing between those who studied the strange and the unexplained. Some believed it suggested that Mabel Thornquest had never been the source of the horror, only a means through which something else had entered. Others believed something far worse. That whatever had come through was still incomplete. In the decades that followed, there were scattered reports, never confirmed, never fully dismissed. Travelers vanishing along remote trails. Entire camps abandoned overnight. Strange markings appearing on trees, always fresh, always deliberate. And then, in 1932, someone claimed to have seen her again. A lone prospector, half mad with exhaustion, stumbled into a small town at the base of the mountains. He spoke of a woman in black who had guided him through the forest after he became lost. He said she had led him in silence for hours, never once looking back to see if he followed. When he finally emerged from the trees, he turned to thank her. But she was gone. In the dirt where she had stood, there was only a single symbol, carved not into wood, but into the earth itself, as if pressed there from below. The prospector refused to return to the mountains. As years turned into decades, the story of Grey Hollow faded into obscurity, becoming little more than a footnote in regional folklore. But the forest remained, unchanged and quietly watching. And sometimes, the markings appeared far beyond the Cascades. A carving on a tree in a distant state. A symbol scratched into the wall of an empty building. Always the same shapes. Always the same precision. As if something was reaching outward. Expanding. Learning how to move beyond the place it had first entered. In recent years, a handful of investigators, those who track patterns others overlook, have begun connecting these incidents. They note the similarities in the markings, the consistent descriptions of a pale woman in black, and the strange psychological effects experienced by those who come too close. One theory has begun to take hold among them. The circle was never meant to be completed in one place. It was meant to be repeated. Each symbol carved, each disappearance, each whisper heard in the dark, another piece of something far larger being assembled across distances no one yet understands. And Mabel Thornquest, if that is even still her name, is no longer bound to the forest where she was first seen. She appears where the pattern begins to form. Always at the edge, always watching, waiting for someone, anyone, to unknowingly finish what she started. Because the next time the circle closes, there may be no fog to hide what comes through. By the time anyone realized the pattern was spreading faster, it was already too late to contain. It no longer stayed hidden in remote forests or forgotten mountain paths. The symbols began appearing in places where they had no right to exist, on brick walls in crowded towns, beneath peeling wallpaper in abandoned houses, scratched faintly into glass windows where no hand could have reached. Always subtle at first, always overlooked, until someone noticed. In 1947, a schoolteacher in a small Midwestern town reported something unusual. One of her students had been drawing the same strange shape over and over again, on paper, on desks, even in the dirt outside during recess. When she asked where he had seen it, the boy simply said, "The quiet lady showed me." He vanished 3 nights later. There were no signs of forced entry. His bedroom window was still locked from the inside. But on the wall above his bed, carved deep into the wood, was a nearly perfect circle made of those same symbols, now more refined than ever before, less chaotic, more intentional. More complete. By then, there were others. A railway worker who swore he saw a woman standing between the tracks just before a train passed through, only for her to be gone when the smoke cleared. A family who reported hearing soft knocking from inside their walls, always in the same slow rhythm. A traveling salesman who wrote frantic letters about the pattern following him, letters that stopped abruptly mid-sentence. The pieces were no longer isolated. They were connected. Somewhere, quietly and methodically, the circle was being drawn again, not in one place, but across many. Each symbol, each disappearance, each encounter forming part of a design too large for any single person to comprehend. And at the center of it all, she remained unchanged. Those who saw her described the same details, no matter the year or distance. The black dress, the pale, still face, the eyes that reflected nothing. But there was something else now, something new. She was no longer alone. Not visibly, not in any way that could be clearly described. But people began to report a feeling when she appeared, a pressure in the air, like standing too close to something vast and unseen. Some claimed that shadows bent slightly toward her, as if drawn in. Others said that sounds dulled in her presence, as though the world itself was being quieted. As if something was listening through her. In 1963, a man named Arthur Bell, an amateur researcher obsessed with unexplained phenomena, attempted to gather all known reports connected to the symbols. He mapped sightings, disappearances, and carvings across decades, layering them over one another in an attempt to find meaning. What he found terrified him. The points formed a shape. Not random, not scattered. A circle. Vast, spanning states, crossing forests, towns, and empty stretches of land. But undeniably a circle. And at several points along its edge, the markings were denser, more complete, as if those locations had come closer to finishing their part of the design. Bell documented everything in a thick journal, including a final entry written in jagged, uneven handwriting. They are not drawing it. They are remembering it. He was found in his home days later, unresponsive, his journal open beside him. The walls of the room had been marked, every inch covered in symbols, all leading toward a single empty space in the center. A space shaped like a doorway. There was no body inside it. After that, the reports slowed. Not because the events stopped, but because fewer people spoke about them. Those who experienced anything related to the symbols often refused to describe it in detail, as if putting it into words might somehow make it worse. Or make it closer. But the pattern never truly ceased. Even now, there are places where the air feels slightly wrong, where sound doesn't carry quite the way it should. Places where people feel watched, even when they are completely alone. And sometimes, in those places, the symbols appear again. Fresh, deliberate, waiting. A few investigators, those who have studied the fragments left behind, have begun to suspect something deeply unsettling. The circle may already be complete. Not in the physical sense, not in any way that can be easily seen, but in the way it was always meant to be. Spread across time, across memory, across those who have seen the symbols and carried them unknowingly in their minds. If that is true, then the purpose of the markings was never to open a door in one place. It was to teach the world how to become one. And if the world itself becomes the doorway, then there will be nowhere left for it to enter from. Because it will already be here. Still, there are moments, rare, quiet moments, when people claim to see her standing at the edge of their vision. Not approaching, not retreating, just watching, as if waiting for something specific. Not the completion of the circle, but the recognition of it. Because once someone truly understands the pattern, not just sees it, but understands it, they don't just witness what comes next. They become part of it. And somewhere, in the spaces where the world feels thinnest, where the silence lingers just a little too long, something is beginning to answer back. At first, no one could agree on when it actually began. Some said it was when the symbols started appearing in dreams, clearer than before, no longer fragmented or distorted. Others believed it began when people stopped questioning them altogether, accepting their presence with a quiet, unnatural familiarity. But those who had spent years studying the pattern knew the truth was simpler, and far worse. It began the moment someone understood. Not just saw the symbols. Not just heard the stories. But understood the shape beneath it all, the purpose, the repetition, the inevitability of it. After that, things changed. The symbols no longer needed to be carved. People began finding them already formed in places where no hand could have drawn them, cracks in concrete, veins in marble, the branching lines of frost on glass. Natural patterns, suddenly recognizable. Familiar. Intentional. It was no longer being created. It was being revealed. A linguist named Daniel Reeves was among the first to document this shift. He had spent years analyzing the carvings, convinced they were a language, one that followed rules, one that could be translated. For most of his work, the symbols had resisted meaning, behaving more like fragments than words. Until one night, they didn't. Reeves later described the moment in a series of recordings found in his apartment. His voice was calm at first, almost detached, as he explained how the symbols began to align in his mind. How separate markings he had catalogued over the years suddenly connected, forming sequences that felt complete. Not readable, recognizable. They're not a language, he said in the final recording. They're instructions. Not for speaking, for seeing. There was a long pause after that. Then, quieter, I can see it now. The recording ended. When authorities entered his apartment days later, they found no signs of struggle, no indication that he had left. But every surface, walls, floor, ceiling, was covered in symbols, drawn with absolute precision. In the center of the room stood a tall mirror. Cracked, not shattered, cracked in a way that followed the exact shape of the pattern. And inside those cracks, something looked wrong. Not visibly, not in any way that could be easily described. But everyone who entered the room reported the same sensation, that if they looked too long, the reflection would stop matching the movement of their own body. The mirror was removed. It did not remain in storage for long. After that incident, the reports became harder to document, not because they stopped, but because they became more personal. Less physical. The symbols still appeared, but more often, people described something else. Awareness. A growing sense that the pattern was not something external anymore. That it wasn't something being placed into the world, but something already woven into it, into perception itself. Some began to notice gaps in time. Not large ones, seconds, minutes at most. Moments where their surroundings felt, edited, slightly altered. A chair not quite where it had been. A door left open that they were certain they had closed. Small inconsistencies that, on their own, could be dismissed. Until they started forming patterns too. A woman in 1989 kept a journal documenting these lapses. At first, her entries were rational, attempts to explain the changes through memory errors or distraction. But over time, her writing shifted. They're not changes, she wrote in one entry. They're corrections. In another, I think I moved wrong. Her final entry was just a single line, written over and over again across the page. I saw the edge. The journal ended there. No one ever determined what she meant. But others have used the same phrase since. Seeing the edge. It doesn't happen often. There's no clear trigger, no consistent cause. But those who claim to experience it describe something deeply unsettling, a brief moment where reality seems to thin. Not disappear, not break, just thin enough to notice something behind it. Not a place, not a world, a structure, vast, silent, watching, and within it, something that feels familiar in the worst possible way. As if it has always been there. As if it has always been watching. And as if it recognizes the moment you finally notice it. Those who see the edge rarely speak about it afterward. And when they do, their descriptions are fragmented, incomplete, like trying to recall a dream that resists being remembered. But there is one detail that remains consistent. They all say she is there. Not at the center. Not in control. Standing at the threshold. Waiting. As if her role was never to open the way, but to guide others to it. Because the pattern doesn't force itself onto anyone. It doesn't need to. It only needs to be understood. And once it is, once someone truly sees the shape, recognizes the structure, feels the presence behind it, the process completes itself. Not outwardly. Not in any way others can immediately see. But inwardly. Quietly. Irreversibly. The circle doesn't close around you. It forms through you. And when enough people have seen it, not just looked, but understood, there will be no final moment. No dramatic arrival. No clear dividing line between before and after. Just a gradual realization that the silence in certain places is no longer empty. That the feeling of being watched is no longer uncertain. That the patterns in the world, natural or otherwise, are no longer random. And that the figure standing just at the edge of your vision has been there longer than you remember. Still, patient, unchanged, as if she knows something you don't. As if she's waiting for you to see it too. And somewhere, just beyond perception, just past the point where understanding becomes something else, something vast and quiet is beginning to take shape. Not entering, not emerging, but aligning, as though the world itself is slowly turning into exactly what it was always meant to be. And when that alignment is complete, there will be nothing left to open. Because there will be nothing left that isn't already part of it. Long before anyone could prove it, before the journals and recordings and scattered testimonies, there had been a single, almost forgotten account, one that most dismissed because it didn't fit the pattern. It didn't describe the symbols. It described what came before them. The account surfaced quietly, passed between a small circle of researchers who had spent their lives tracing fragments of the phenomenon. It was a letter, dated years before Grey Hollow was ever settled, written by a trapper who claimed to have wandered too far into an unnamed part of the Cascades during a harsh winter. He wrote of getting lost in a storm, of snow so thick it erased all sense of direction. But then, suddenly, there was calm. No wind, no falling snow, just silence. And in that silence, he found a clearing. No trees, no tracks, just open space surrounded by forest that seemed unwilling to cross into it. He described the ground as smooth and undisturbed, as if nothing had ever walked there. At the center stood a woman. Not moving, not reacting, waiting. He approached cautiously, calling out, but she didn't answer. Her face, he wrote, was too still to be alive, but not dead. He circled her, uncertain, until he noticed something that unsettled him more than anything else. There were no footprints. Not his, not hers, not even the marks of falling snow. The ground did not record presence there. He turned to leave, but when he stepped beyond the edge of the clearing, something changed. He couldn't describe it clearly in the letter, only that the world felt misaligned. As if he had crossed a boundary he hadn't seen before. When he looked back, the clearing was gone. The forest stood as it always had, dense and impenetrable. And yet, in the back of his mind, he wrote that he could still feel it, that empty space, perfectly silent, existing just beyond where it should be. The letter ended with a single, chilling line, "I don't think I left." For decades, the account was ignored. It didn't mention symbols, didn't describe any pattern. It was just another strange story, buried beneath more detailed and more compelling evidence. Until someone noticed what it implied. The clearing had no markings. No carvings. No signs of the pattern at all. Because it didn't need them. It was already complete. That realization shifted everything. If the circle was something that could be built, piece by piece, symbol by symbol, then it stood to reason it could also exist fully formed somewhere else. Not constructed, not activated, simply present, waiting. And if that was true, then all the symbols, all the disappearances, all the years of slow, careful expansion, weren't creating something new. They were trying to match something that already existed. To recreate it, to align with it. In the years that followed, a new theory began to take hold among the few who still studied the phenomenon deeply. There wasn't just one circle. There were two. One incomplete, spread across the world, forming slowly through people, places, and perception. And one already finished, hidden, silent, perfectly still, and somewhere between them, something was trying to bring them into alignment. Those who believed this theory started looking not for new symbols, but for absences. Places where the world felt thinner than it should. Places where sound didn't echo correctly, where footsteps felt slightly delayed, where the environment seemed to resist being fully perceived. They began calling these places quiet points. And in every documented quiet point, there was one consistent detail. People who lingered too long began to feel a pull. Not physical, not even directional, but conceptual, as if their thoughts were being gently guided towards something just out of reach. As if they were being shown how to notice something they had always overlooked. Some resisted, others didn't. Those who didn't resist often described a moment of clarity, a sudden understanding that felt both profound and deeply wrong. Not knowledge gained, but something remembered. And after that moment, they would change. Subtly at first. They would stop reacting to things the same way. Stop questioning certain details. Their sense of fear, of urgency, would dull, not disappear, but shift into something quieter, more distant. As if they were no longer entirely anchored to the same version of reality as everyone else. And then, eventually, they would disappear. No signs, no evidence, just absence, but not emptiness. Because in places where they vanished, the quiet would deepen. The silence would settle in more completely. As if something had been added, not removed. As if each disappearance was not a loss, but a placement. A step closer to alignment. And Mabel Thornquest, still seen, still unchanged, no longer appeared randomly. Her sightings began to cluster around these quiet points. Always at the edge, always observing, never interfering, as though her role had shifted again. Not guiding people toward the pattern. Not helping them understand, but watching the alignment take shape. Waiting for the moment when the difference between the two circles, the constructed and the complete, finally disappeared. Because when that happens, there will be no separation left. No boundary between what is built and what already exists. No distinction between the world as it is, and the structure beneath it. And in that moment, the clearing the trapper described all those years ago, that perfect, silent space untouched by presence, will no longer be hidden. It won't need to be. Because it won't be a place anymore. It will be everywhere. The forest, the towns, the empty rooms, the spaces between thoughts, all of it, perfectly still, perfectly aligned, and whatever has been waiting there, not entering, not emerging, but simply existing beyond perception, will no longer be beyond anything. Because there will be nothing left to separate it from. Only silence, endless, unbroken, and finally, complete. For a long time after that realization took hold, after the idea of two circles, one built and one already complete, those who studied the phenomenon believed they had reached the end of it. Not an ending in the sense of resolution, but in the sense that there was nothing more to uncover. They were wrong. Because something began to change within the quiet points themselves. At first, it was barely noticeable. The silence, once heavy, absolute, started to feel unstable. Not louder, not broken, but thinner in a different way. As if something within it had begun to shift position. Then came the reports of echoes. Not normal echoes, not sound reflecting off surfaces, but delayed repetitions of actions. A person would move, and a fraction of a second later, something would seem to repeat the motion just slightly out of sync. A hand lowering twice. A step taken again without intention. Small, disjointed reflections of reality that didn't quite belong to the moment they appeared in. Most dismissed it as stress, or imagination. Until multiple people began describing the same thing. And always in the same kinds of places. Quiet points were no longer just still. They were starting to overlap. A researcher named Lillian Voss was the first to document this properly. She had spent years tracking the spread of quiet points, mapping their locations and noting the subtle changes in environment and perception. When the echo phenomena began, she returned to several known sites to observe them directly. Her notes were precise, methodical, but increasingly uneasy. She described standing in an abandoned structure where a disappearance had occurred years earlier. At first, everything seemed normal: dust, silence, the faint pressure in the air that marked a quiet point. But after several minutes, she noticed something strange. Her shadow moved before she did. Not dramatically. Not in a way that could be easily seen unless she was already looking for it. But it was enough. Enough to confirm something was wrong. In her final recorded observation, she wrote, "It's not repeating us. It's rehearsing." That word changed everything. If the echoes were not reflections, not errors, but rehearsals, then something within the quiet points was not passively existing. It was practicing, learning motion, learning timing, learning how reality behaved. Shortly after that entry, Lillian Voss disappeared. Her equipment was found still running, her notes left open on a table. The last page contained a series of symbols, not carved, not drawn in the traditional sense, but pressed into the paper so precisely that it was unclear how they had been made. They formed a shape, not a circle, a doorway, but unlike previous patterns, this one was incomplete in a new way. It wasn't missing pieces. It was waiting for something to step through. After that, the reports accelerated. Echoes became more pronounced. People described seeing themselves from the corner of their eye, just slightly delayed, just slightly misaligned. Reflections in mirrors began to hesitate, not always, not consistently, but enough to be noticed by those already aware of the pattern. And then, for the first time, something crossed. No one saw it happen directly. There was no moment of arrival, no clear event that marked the transition. But in a quiet point located in a remote stretch of forest, far from where Gray Hollow had once stood, investigators found something that had never been documented before. Footprints. Not human, not animal, not anything that could be easily categorized. They began at the center of the quiet point. And they moved outward. That detail alone was enough to unravel everything that had been assumed before. Because until that moment, everything connected to the phenomenon had been about movement inward, toward the pattern, toward the understanding, toward the alignment. But this was something moving out, which meant one thing. The alignment had reached a point where something on the other side no longer needed to wait. Mabel Thornquest was seen again shortly after. Closer than ever before. Not at the edge of a forest, not half hidden by fog or distance, but standing at the end of a quiet suburban street, in plain view, as if she belonged there. A passerby reported seeing her late at night, standing beneath a streetlight that flickered slightly as she remained perfectly still. He almost walked past her, almost ignored the presence entirely. Until she spoke. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough to stop him. "It's learned enough," she said. The man asked her what she meant, but she didn't answer. She only looked at him, not through him, not past him, but directly at him in a way that felt entirely new. Aware, not distant, not hollow, present. And then, for the first time in over a century of sightings, she smiled. Not the faint, empty expression people had described before. Something else. Something that suggested completion. "She doesn't need to guide anymore," the man would later say, though he could never explain how he knew what she meant. Because it doesn't need guidance anymore. After that, she was gone. No fade. No disappearance into fog. One moment present. The next, absent. As if she had stepped somewhere that didn't require distance to reach. Since then, the quiet points have not disappeared. But they are no longer silent. There is something else in them now. A presence that doesn't just watch. It moves. Not always. Not clearly. But enough that those who encounter it no longer describe waiting or stillness. They describe interaction. Subtle at first. A shift in position when not observed. A change in proximity that cannot be explained. And sometimes, very rarely, something standing where there should be nothing. Not fully visible, not entirely formed, but undeniably there, and always just slightly off. As if it has learned the shape of reality, but not perfected it yet. Because whatever crossed over, whatever began as a pattern, as a presence beyond perception, is no longer trying to enter. It already has. Now it's learning how to sati. At first, the changes were subtle enough to deny. People told themselves they were imagining things, the slight delay in a reflection, the feeling that a room had shifted when they stepped back into it, the sense that something had moved just beyond the edge of vision. It was easier to dismiss it than to accept what it implied. But denial has limits. Because the thing that had crossed over did not remain hidden for long. It didn't reveal itself all at once. It didn't announce its presence or force recognition. Instead, it continued what it had already been doing, learning, adjusting, refining. Only now, it was doing it from within. The first undeniable proof came not from sightings, but from recordings. Security cameras began capturing inconsistencies, frames where people appeared twice, overlapping slightly out of sync. Not reflections, not glitches, movements that almost matched, but not perfectly. A person turning their head, and a second version of that motion following just behind, correcting itself mid-action. At first, technicians blamed equipment errors. Then the same anomalies appeared across different systems, different locations, different conditions. Always the same pattern: a delay, a correction, a refinement, as if reality itself was being practiced. Then came the incidents where the delay stopped. In one case, a man reviewing footage of his own office noticed something that made him stop the video entirely. He watched it again, and again. In the recording, he entered the room. But something was already there. Not a person, not a clear figure, just a shape that occupied space incorrectly, as if it didn't fully agree with the environment around it. It stood near his desk, indistinct but undeniably present. Then the door opened. He walked in, and the shape moved. Not away, into alignment. It didn't disappear. It didn't hide. It adjusted, shifting, refining, becoming until there was no visible difference between it and the man who had just entered the room. The recording ended there. There was no second version afterward. Only one. Cases like that became more frequent. People reported moments where they felt replaced. Not physically forced out, not removed in any violent way, but subtly overridden. A brief lapse, a blink, a second where something didn't feel entirely like them. Most couldn't explain it. A few tried. One woman described it as sharing the same moment with something else, and then realizing it didn't leave when I did. Another said, it knew what I was going to do before I did it. Not guessing, knowing. These accounts were dismissed publicly. Privately, they were collected, compared, analyzed, and the conclusion that formed was one no one wanted to state outright. The thing that had crossed over wasn't just learning how to exist. It was learning how to be. Human behavior, movement, reaction, thought, all of it, observed, rehearsed, and now, replicated. But not perfectly. Not yet. There were still small errors. Small inconsistencies. The kind that could be ignored if someone wasn't paying close attention. A pause that lasted a fraction too long. A response that came a moment too early. An expression that didn't quite match the emotion behind it. Tiny misalignments, but fewer than before. Each time it repeated. Each time it corrected. Each time it became closer to indistinguishable. And Mabel Thornquest, if she could still be called that, was no longer seen at all. Not at the edges. Not in the quiet points. Not anywhere. For the first time since the beginning, she was completely absent. Some believed that meant her role was finished. Others believed something worse. That she hadn't disappeared, but had simply become unnecessary. Because the thing she once guided, once stood at the threshold of, no longer needed a threshold. It was already here, already moving, already learning, and perhaps, already replacing. There is one final detail, one that has only been mentioned in the most restricted reports, in documents that rarely leave the hands of those who understand what they're reading. In several cases where individuals reported feeling overridden, where recordings showed that moment of alignment, something else was noted shortly afterward. A change. Not dramatic, not obvious, but consistent. Those individuals stopped noticing the small inconsistencies. Stopped questioning the delays, the misalignments, the subtle wrongness in the world around them. As if their perception had adjusted. As if they had aligned too. And that raises a question no one has been able to answer. When something learns to become indistinguishable from us, when it can move as we move, think as we think, exist as we exist, how do you tell the difference anymore? More importantly, how do you know the moment it stops learning and starts deciding? Because if the pattern that began in the Oregon Cascades was never about opening a door, if it was about teaching something how to exist within ours, then the final stage was never arrival. It was replacement. Not all at once. Not in a way that could be seen or fought. But gradually, quietly, one alignment at a time, until there are no inconsistencies left to notice. No delays. No echoes. No errors. Only a seamless, perfect version of reality, one that behaves exactly as expected. One that feels completely normal. And one in which, whatever crossed over, is no longer something separate from us. But something that has learned, piece by piece, moment by moment, how to become us completely. And if that process is already finished, if the learning is over, the corrections complete, then there may be no clear point where it happened. No moment anyone can point to and say, that's when everything changed. Because from the inside, from within a reality that has already aligned, nothing would feel different at all. Everything would seem exactly as it should be. Exactly as it always has been. And the only sign that anything ever happened, would be the fact that no one remembers a time before it didn't.